good afternoon, good morning, good evening. Can't believe it's November 4th, the night before our big elections. Welcome. I am Janice Kaminer-Resnick, and I welcome you on behalf of the members of our leadership team, former Congressman Mel Levine and former LA County Supervisor Zev Yaroslavsky. Welcome back, and many thanks to tonight's guests, the extraordinary Lynn Vavreck and Norm Ornstein. We so appreciate you sharing this time with us tonight on election eve. We know there are many demands on both of you, so we're really very pleased and rewarded that you're with us. We're looking forward to your informed perspectives on tomorrow's election, not only vis-a-vis the presidential election, but also about the congressional and Senate races. And of course, welcome and thanks to our moderator, the amazing Patt Morrison, also being pulled in a million directions right now. So thanks to all three of you. As our pre-election programming comes to an end, I decided to spend just a minute taking stock of the year. Since January, we have presented more than 60 programs to tens of thousands of people who've watched live and watched via YouTube or listened to our podcast. There's almost no relevant election 2024 topic that we haven't covered, and covered with the country's most outstanding thinkers and analysts. Post-election, we will continue our programming back mostly to once a week on Wednesdays at 5 Pacific, with a break for Thanksgiving and a break at the very end of December. But just for good measure, next week we do have two programs. First on Monday with a special post-election post-mortem. I hate that word, especially right now. A post-election program. We welcome the extremely knowledgeable and highly respected analyst Ron Brownstein. Anyone who is familiar with Ron, and our audience knows he has an inhuman depth of knowledge about all aspects of campaigns and results in probably every voting district in the United States. So he will surely have lots to share with us on the results of next Tuesday of tomorrow's election, which will by then hopefully be clear. And then on Wednesday, November 13th, we host Jason Tietenhoff, former member of and former spokesperson for the far-right paramilitary group, the Oath Keepers, whose members were involved in the January 6th insurrection. Jason testified against the Oath Keepers before the House Select Committee on the January 6th insurrection. I'm really sorry. I guess I'm nervous tonight. Jason will be in conversation with Larry Mantle on the ominous but important topic, the perils of extremism, how I left the Oath Keepers, and why we should be worried about another civil war. Quite the topic. It's the title of his book, and it's quite the topic for the Times. I'm sure that the vast majority of our audience has already voted, and I think I'm right in suspecting that this audience has a 100% voter turnout. So congratulations to you and to us, and we can all be proud of that and hopeful. Now, to introduce tonight's guests and to lead our discussion, please welcome the winner of Emmys, Golden Mikes, and part of a Pulitzer, and more, the extraordinary Patt Morrison of the Los Angeles Times. Pat, the program is yours, and thank you for being with us.
Thank you, Janice. Thank you, everyone, and welcome to you and to your fluttering tummies this evening. I'm going to try to make them feel a little calmer in this one day before what we are hearing, to the point of, well, cliche, but cliches are true, the most important election in our lifetimes and perhaps in the history of this country. We are joined in order to do so by Lynn Vavreck, a political scientist who teaches American politics and public policy at UCLA. She's an expert in campaigns and elections and author of many books on the subject, among them two acclaimed studies of the 2012 and 2016 elections. Also Norm Ornstein, a senior fellow emeritus at the American Enterprise Institute, where he's been studying politics, elections, and the U.S. Congress for more than 4 decades, and is possibly the most knowledgeable person in the country about the U.S. Congress. Let's see, among other books that he has written, he has co-founded and co-wrote the go-to reference guide that provides impartial data for congressional watchers. The guide's updated every 2 years and is considered a sort of Bible with vital statistics about Congress and its members, but his knowledge is much wider than that. Both of you, thank you so much for joining us. The only measure that seems that Americans find useful, and maybe they shouldn't, but right now it's the polls. And with that in mind, you can tell us a little bit, starting with Lynn and then Norm, about whether we should be doing this to ourselves or not.
Yes, thanks so much for having me. I'm really happy to be back with everyone tonight. And yes, Pat, I think that it is our best guide to what we might see tomorrow. So I'm a big believer in polls, and I think they're giving us a pretty good indication that this race is going to be close. It's going to be close all night long, and I think that I know lots of people are anticipating maybe it'll be a blowout in this direction, maybe it'll be a blowout in that direction. But I'm going to stick with my money's on the polls. This one's going to be a squeaker.
And Norm, we hear that this late in the whole process of the election, that it isn't really about the numbers we may be seeing. It may be about the shifts, that where things are moving may be more important than the numbers, the fixed in time numbers themselves.
So I will take a little issue with Lynn here. I started looking at polling and doing polling a long, long time ago when I was at the Institute for Social Research at the University of Michigan. And then for the LA Times and Times Mirror, I was involved in creating the typology of voters that then morphed into the Pew Research Center. So I know something about polls, and now they suck. And here's a reason why they suck, generally, or a few reasons. The first is response rates are about 3%. That's down from when I actually talked to the American Association of Public Opinion research some years ago about the crisis in polling when it was response rates were 9%. So now pollsters are struggling. First, many of them still don't use cell phones because it's more expensive. Those that do are finding something that's not surprising. My phone rings 20 times a day. Nowadays, 15 of them are candidates wanting more money. That's no good deed goes unpunished when you give a contribution. But the others are spam calls. And my home phone, I don't even answer anymore because it's spam calls or phishing or marketing. So response rates are low. What do pollsters do? Well, some of them are trying other methods, including using the internet. We're still not sure what's good and what isn't. But what's also true is that they basically then try to construct from that 3% something that reflects the broader electorate. And what they're doing now and what they have done for the last several cycles is they try and do that based on the last presidential election. So they replicate the mistakes of the past presidential election. Many of these surveys that are showing an absolute dead heat have the proportion of women at roughly 50%. And we know that it's going to be different. It's going to be greater than that. At the same time, we see a couple of other things. We see a herding effect, especially as you get close to the election. Pollsters don't want to be out there looking like they're outliers. So they try to, just sort of look all the same. And then you have something that we talked about before we began, which is strategic. And what we've seen the last several cycles is that as we get close to an election, of course, for a lot of people, they don't want to look at an individual poll. Some are good, some are bad. Frankly, the news organizations fall back on doing polling and the horse race because that's easy to do and you are less likely to be charged with being biased. They aggregate these surveys. But a lot of conservative and Republican pollsters flood the zone with polls that look like they're moving in their direction and then just adjust at the last minute. So let's put all of that out there. Having said that, given the nature of the country, we're not going to see a blowout. We're not going to see a romp where a candidate wins, as Ronald Reagan did in 1980, 44 states. But we could see a more comfortable margin, one where a candidate wins most of, or at least enough of, the battleground states, and maybe a surprise or two, as we might see in Iowa. And that the only way that that works, I believe, almost certainly, if there is one, would be Kamala Harris.
Um, Lynn, you recently took part in a panel where the question to the audience and the panelists was, can the electorate be moved in today's polarized world? Or are we so hardened in our silos by this point that we're convinced that we know absolutely who we like or who we don't like?
Yeah, persuasion is hard. That should be the top of everyone's mind. It's always been hard, but especially in today's political context, the parties want to build two very different worlds. Voters know that. They tell us that they can see important differences. 9 out of 10 people say they see important differences between the two political parties, and they know which world they'd rather live in. So it is very hard to move people who are attentive to politics and who pay attention to politics. But that's not everybody. And there is a set of people who are tuning in, hopefully not today for the first time, but maybe in the last 3 or 4 weeks.
Well, now that the World Series is over, they can pay attention.
Exactly. Now that the Dodgers have won the World Series, they can start paying attention. And for those people, it's not so much that you're going to move their to the extent that they have opinions and they know what kind of world they want to live in. It's not so much you're going to change their mind. It's that you're going to change the things that they think are the most important things that this election should be decided on.
Yeah.
And that is not exactly persuasion, but it is something that can tip that last segment of the electorate one way or the other.
So, for example, with the Puerto Rican joke at the Trump rally a week or so ago, maybe Puerto Rican voters had X as their priority, and that changed?
It could be. It could be that people were thinking, the most important thing to me is the economy. I can't take my family on vacation. I can't buy a new car. And then they see the Madison Square Garden rally and they say, you know what? Character really matters to me, or I don't like what they're saying about Puerto Rico. And so this democracy and character is now more important to me. And they have had the same position on those things the whole time. It's just now it's like we're baking a cake and the recipe is changing. We're adding a little bit more sugar and a little less flour.
A little later in the program, we're going to put your questions to our guests. So if you'd like to put your questions in the Q&A box, we will have them up and go through them in a little while in order to get around to some of the things that are on your mind, that are top of your mind here. Norm, we talk about whether people vote on issues or vote on, values versus their own interests, and we also wonder in this case whether, as far as Donald Trump is concerned, how much of what the voters are paying attention to are issues and how much of it is personality. And in a sense, some people are tired of his years-long show and some people want it to run forever.
So, issues, I think, for a whole lot of voters don't matter in the traditional sense. And it's particularly true because the fact is, most of the reporting about the election is not about issues or the stakes or about at least the firm differences between the candidates. It is a horse race kind of thing, and people are voting more on the basis of values. And we know that the watchword for most of our elections now in a tribal environment is negative partisanship. It's people not necessarily voting for their own candidate or even all of the things that that candidate stands for. Although some issues, the border, inflation, will matter, but it is, I want to stick it to those evil people who are trying to destroy our way of life. That has been the life's blood for Donald Trump. And it is why when he said, I could shoot somebody in broad daylight on Fifth Avenue and not lose a vote, he wasn't far off. I actually think for a substantial share of the Trump voters, he could take out an AR-15 and mow down all of Fifth Avenue, and it wouldn't change their votes because they wouldn't give aid and comfort to their enemies. But there is some cracking in that cult, frankly, at this point. And that's why, as you mentioned, Madison Square Garden, Pat, let me go back to 1980. If you looked at the polls then, they showed a neck and neck race between Ronald Reagan and Jimmy Carter right up until close to the end. And then we had, you can't quite call it an October surprise, but what we saw was a couple of things. In a debate, and back then people watched the debates, Ronald Reagan said, are you better off now than you were 4 years ago? And that framed the election in a different way. And Jimmy Carter, talking in the debate, talked about how he used to consult with, or he would discuss the nuclear war issue with his daughter, Amy.
Who
And
was
that
12?
got construed as, life and death, and you're talking about it with your young daughter. And they just created a dramatic difference that led to a romp for Ronald Reagan. We
Did
do
that really do it? The fact that he talked to his 12-year-old daughter
I
about,
think, it was people who were thinking that they were going to vote with their party, thinking they'd vote for the incumbent. Basically, it just created a different dynamic in the final 2 weeks of the campaign. No doubt, America held hostage the ABC program that turned into Nightline over the hostages in Iran made a difference. But we know that things that happen in October can concentrate people's minds, especially for a lot of people who don't pay attention until we get very close to it. And on that basis, I would say that while I thought the October surprise might be Bibi Netanyahu triggering a much wider conflagration with Iran, excuse me, that Madison Square Garden and the hate fest there is having an impact. And
so
we're
that's the equivalent, the Madison Square Garden rally, you think is the equivalent
Yes,
to
that's our
1980?
October surprise. And what we're seeing is, by almost every standard, late breaking voters are going substantially for Kamala Harris. And, keep in mind that in these battleground states that are going to be close, but they could easily tip one way. And we might know earlier than we thought on some of them, although for those that don't count absentee and early votes until the polls close, it'll take a while. 400,000 Puerto Ricans in Pennsylvania, a lot of Haitian Americans who are already kind of upset, and others. I think it's made a difference. It's the closing arguments now that are making a difference. And that I think could make a substantial impact on where we come out.
So, Lynn, you wrote about the 2016 election, and this is a bit of a step back, but critical nonetheless. The difference, as we saw crucially in the 2016 election between the popular vote and the Electoral College vote, people who hadn't even thought about the Electoral College before now have it front and center. I just got back from vacation in Europe where people were puzzled by this, how the person with the most votes cannot win. How critical is this a strategic consideration for voters? Is how much of a strategic, we've seen how much of a strategic consideration it is for candidates, but even now it's like this seems like something else that's in flux. Like, will the Electoral College ever give up, relinquish its hold on who determines the president of the United States? So many things coming to the fore that didn't really seem to be front and center for voters.
There's not too much voters can do about it at this point unless they want to relocate from where they live to
And
a
some
state
people
where they
have.
can. And some people have, and maybe the pandemic will change some of that. But there's not a lot for voters to do at this point. I will say that it is increasingly a topic. That could be just the people who invite me to speak to them. But there are lots of good and compelling reasons to think that it should be a national popular vote. But I always feel obligated to throw out some considerations that may make that seem not so attractive. And there are just two. If it's a national popular vote, you will see the candidates mostly going to population centers. Now they go to battleground states. They'll go to where the people live. And the second thing is that if you're worried about election fraud, maybe foreign interference in an election, with the Electoral College, if you wanted to steal votes, you need to figure out which states are going to be close and then which counties in those states are going to be close. You have to know how those counties vote, what's the machinery, and you have to be right about all those decisions. If you move to a national popular vote and the election is going to turn on a couple 100,000 votes, you can come to Los Angeles County and you can wreak your havoc only there. And so if you're concerned about that, you might want to think about some of those things. But I would say that this is a conversation that is not going away. It will be very difficult to change, where we are. This is protected. But it's not impossible, but it is not going to happen in the next 4 years.
So I'll get to another question with you, Lynn, following up on that. But if you have a question for our guests, you can please put it in the Q&A box and we'll try to get to all of the questions a little later in the program. Lynn, one pronounced aspect of this year's election, more than double digits, far more than double digits of the gender gap. Just this weekend, Judith Kent, who's the wife of Jamie Dimon, who's the CEO of J.P. Morgan, was out door knocking in the state of Michigan. And we've been hearing time after time from canvassers of stories of, wives who will answer the door and who will make it clear that they can't talk because their husbands are listening, and they can't talk because the Ring doorbell is recording, or they'll stand behind husbands who say, I'm not going to let you talk to her. And they're going like this, like for Harris. So all of a sudden, the gender factor has become tremendous. Is this just because of Donald Trump, or is this something else in addition to that?
Well, it's not just Donald Trump, it's the policy space that we find ourselves in. And women are drawn to Kamala Harris because of her position on abortion. And you can see that coming through in the polls. And I suspect that when we get the exit polling tomorrow and we ask people what was on your mind when you cast your ballot, and we look at the difference between women and men, there are going to be differences. And I suspect women will be thinking about abortion more than men. So I think that some of this is, again, not Trump's character. That hasn't changed. His character is the same in 2024 as it was in 2020, as it was in 2016. If we're trying to explain change, we can't do that with a constant. We have to do it with something that's changing. And what has changed is the current state of status quo around abortion rights.
And Norm, you've got decades of data to refer to here. Maybe demography and geography and gender have kind of changed places as to what's more important, that you have women with no or little college education and women with a lot of college education, younger women over 65 seem to be coalescing around Harris, if only for these issues. So the questions of income and education in this instance may not be as important for women voters.
Pat, in 2022, most of the pollsters predicted a red wave. Now, that was partly because of the Republican pollsters flooding the zone close to the election, but it was also because the pollsters basically discounted the impact of the abortion decision. And it made a big difference. There was no red wave. The Republicans eked out a little bit of a victory in the House of Representatives, something we might want to talk about the future of that a little bit further down the road, but did not pick up the Senate and actually lost chambers in state legislatures, which is a rarity in those midterm elections. This time around, we see the same thing. Pollsters and an awful lot of political analysts have discounted abortion. They're wrong. I think it is, as Lynn was suggesting, big, and it's big now for a couple of additional reasons. It's Trump, but it's Trump also bragging about how he killed Roe v. Wade, about it was his Supreme Court justices, but it's also Trump in his closing message saying, I'm going to protect women, whether they like it or not. When I heard that, I thought back to the Access Hollywood tape. It's almost like I'm going to grab them by the pussy, whether they like it or not. And I think what we see in this Iowa poll, what we see in a Kansas poll that shows a much closer race than anyone would have expected, even in Ohio, where Harris is not going to win, but where the numbers seem to have gotten closer, is older women are basically coalescing behind Harris in a way we might not have seen. In Iowa, it's also because their legislature implemented a 6-week abortion ban just a few months ago, and there has been mayhem as a consequence. And what we've also seen in these final weeks is more focus on some of these horrific tragedies. An 18-year-old in Texas with sepsis and refused care, even as she is clearly dying of her sepsis, an obstetrician fearing death, saying we need 2 ultrasounds to prove that the fetus has already died. And then, of course, the woman died and the fetus died. This was not somebody seeking an abortion. This was somebody who wanted a child, but had a
And had just gone to her baby shower.
and yeah, wanted this child, had a miscarriage. We have seen so many examples now of deaths and of mayhem that I think it is coalescing an awful lot of voters. And I expect that we're going to see an even more robust turnout of women. I'm not sure what will show up, Lynn, in the exit polls because we're not going to have all that many people who will vote on election day. And frankly, even over the last few cycles, where they've tried to account for that by doing surveys of people who've already voted, it's just not all that clear what will emerge from it. But there's no question that we've seen anecdotally in surveys and in other places that the abortion issue is going to be a big one, and it's acting in a fashion that's amplified now in the final weeks.
Lynn, I'd like to ask you, I mean, first of all, do you disagree with what Norm said, or is there anything else you'd like to?
No, just to reiterate for people that they do, the network exit poll does try to interview people who have voted by mail and voted early. The states list who's submitted their ballots and they randomly sample off of that list. And they do have people at the early in-person polling places to try to get the early vote, which is substantial. It's just getting bigger and bigger every year. People like this convenience of not having to wait in line on election day, and they are trying to get those folks.
Lynn, what do you make of the third party possibilities this time around? Anybody who was here in 2000 remembers the Ralph Nader vote and what that did in Florida and thus into the entire nation. The every 4 years, someone named Jill Stein pops up on ballots. Now we have RFK Jr. running on, I don't know, the roadkill platform or something, along with no vaccines. And it's crucial in some battleground states, as we have seen, as we saw in Michigan in 2016. What do the third party candidacies look like this time around?
I suspect not like they have in the. I don't suspect there'll be spoilers if that's sort of what you're getting at. I think that people understand the high stakes of this election, and they understand that voting for a third party candidate might make their least preferred candidate the winner. And so I don't expect us to be talking a lot about that on election night.
Well, what about the protest vote? We see a lot about that in Michigan, where you have a lot of Muslim American voters who are concerned about Gaza, who say that they want to teach the Democratic Party a lesson, and that they're disappointed with the Biden administration's response on this. And so
Yes,
we'll vote for Trump.
right. That could be one area where we might see this kind of thing pop up. But I don't expect it to be something that is going to happen in many places.
Norm, the question of money in politics they're inextricable, and they have been, ever since the beginning of this republic. But now we see Elon Musk pouring in millions of dollars on behalf of Trump, sometimes effectively, sometimes not. We see the kind of outing of what had been hidden billionaires like Leonard Leo with his agenda about the judiciary. Now it's no longer just lobbyists who want, an exemption for their sorghum crop or lobster fishing season extended. These people want to own the whole system. How effective have those money operators been?
It's a very deeply unsettling because we are seeing people come in and they can often crowd out candidates by buying ads. Candidates have an advantage; they get the lowest unit rate. But if somebody comes in and is willing to pay full price or a premium, they can take over an awful lot of the ad space. This is pernicious, even though some are out. A lot of it is still dark money. It's a cancer on the system. Having said that, and you alluded to Elon Musk, one of the other reasons why I think Harris has got a little bit of an edge here is that the turnout operation really matters in an election like this. And you have to have enthusiasm from your voters, but you have to have ways to make sure that they vote and to do what you can to persuade some of those who are absolutely at the margins. 90,000 volunteers for Democrats. They put a lot of money into the structure. The infrastructure for turnout matters. You have professionals on the ground. When they recruit people, they tell them exactly what to do. You have offices set up to help deal with it. What Donald Trump did when he put his daughter-in-law, Laura, in charge of the Republican National Committee, the first thing she did was to take all the money that they had allocated for the turnout operation to pay off his lawyers. I'm sure with a little bit skimmed off the top for him. And they outsourced that to Elon Musk, who poured a lot of money into it, but had no clue what he was doing. And we've already seen that it's become a farce. So again, at the margins, I think some of this money gets thrown away or used in a fashion that can backfire. You know, we had this farce today where Musk has been doing this presumed lottery, where he has told large numbers of people, if you register to vote and say you're going to support the Constitution, which means support his view of the Constitution, you could be eligible for a lottery. We're going to give out $1 million every day. And that was challenged because no lotteries are allowed in Pennsylvania. And at the courtroom, Musk's lawyers said, well, no, it wasn't really at random. We picked the people in advance. So he lied about what he was doing. And they had pre-picked the people who were going to get these cardboard checks for $1 million. This is not going to work the way he wanted it to work otherwise. And basically, a lot of people, when they see a billionaire like Musk throwing his money around, are very happy to take his money and not do what they were intended to do with it.
Lynn, we're also looking at an election which, as it has always been, it's not a presidential election. It's 51 different presidential elections. 50 states control who gets to vote, when they get to vote. Some states have tightened up voting, requiring these kind of mother may I rules that if you don't send back this form that we're sending you within a couple of weeks, we're going to disqualify you. I may be eligible to vote in one state, but not eligible to vote in another with the exact same background characteristics, personality. That even disenfranchising the military in terms of dates and about timestamps and mailing dates for returning ballots. But how effective is this patchwork approach? And we've just seen in Georgia that there are certain votes that can now be discounted. The GOP had challenged those. Other things went the way of the Democrats in their challenges through the courts. That seems like that we're breaking up rather than developing some uniformity of ballot qualifications, voting qualifications.
Well, it may or may not be efficient, but the Constitution says that elections and carrying out elections, that is the purview of the states. And that's part of federalism, and that's why it is like this. States get to make their rules about voting. Now, we have a long history in this country of how that can go badly. And we have seen the federal government come in and take over. I'm thinking of the southern states in the last half of the last century. And so we have seen the federal government come in and in some cases take over voter registration or say to states, you cannot move polling locations, you cannot change anything about how you're carrying out elections. But the governors in those states were not happy about that, and they fought that. So this is constitutional. It is the way the country is set up. And efficiency that is not the thing we're trying to maximize on this.
And of course, we've seen how the Voting Rights Act was pretty much hamstrung by the Supreme Court. Should we look forward to more similar challenges coming up from different states and groups of voters?
That's a good question. I am sure there are many lawsuits about voting. Most of them about jurisdictions and drawing of maps, about access. So I suspect that there will continue to be, and whether that results in something as big as the Voting Rights Act, I think we'll have to see sort of how things continue to progress.
Well, let me add to that, Pat, that this Supreme Court is a clear and present danger in a lot of different ways. The Constitution, as Lynn said, gives actually the state legislatures some authority over elections in the states, but it can be trumped by Congress. Congress has the clear authority to regulate the time, manner, and place of federal elections. But several justices on this court have indicated an openness to what's called the independent state legislatures theory, which is that even state Supreme Courts who check actions by the state in laws that violate the state constitution, that they have no role to play in this. It's only the legislature. And if that's the case, we're going to see more attempts at voter suppression in states, allowable because it's the legislature, and ruling out the role of the courts. Now, Congress, if it had the ability to do so, if the numbers were there, could come back and say, well, if that's the theory you want to hold to, then the Supreme Court has no role in regulating elections because we have the authority in Congress. But those votes don't exist. And we have, some elements that are a little bit chilling here. It's not a big case in terms of votes, but the Supreme Court just ruled in a case in Virginia where the governor, Glenn Youngkin, a Trumpist, very close to the election, stepped in to say he was going to purge 1,600 voters from the rolls. And it's clear many of them, in some instances, they had gone to register at the DMV before they were citizens, but then became citizens before they were eligible to vote. In others, it was just mistakes. The clear federal law says you cannot purge voters within 90 days of an election. And we have a Supreme Court on the shadow docket, no clear fingerprints, saying, in effect, we don't care what the law said, we're going to let Glenn Youngkin do this. It's 1,600 votes, probably 1,000 of them will be able to vote in the end because they have the ability to come and contest it. But it's a signal of a court that is not necessarily going to follow what Congress does, but follow their own predilections. And that's something we need to be worried about in the aftermath of this election. Unlike 2020, we may not have a Supreme Court that if there's a challenge to the election having been rigged, that will necessarily do the right thing.
I want to put one more question to Norm before we go to our viewers' questions. And Norm, that has to do with a metaphor that came to mind while I was watching old movies the other day. The last election, but even more so this election, you have so many never Trump Republicans. You have Liz Cheney, you have the Lincoln Project, you have hundreds and hundreds of long-standing Republican Party loyalists who were members of previous administrations, and particularly the Trump administration, who are now coming out against him. And the movie that made me think of this was The Wizard of Oz. When Dorothy kills the Wicked Witch, the winged monkeys aren't mad at Dorothy. They're glad at being released from being enthralled to the Wicked Witch. So is this an election that could, if it goes Harris' way, in a sense also liberate the Republican Party to be more of what it used to be? And is that a long, painful struggle, or is that happening pretty quickly?
So I can tell you that there are a number of members of Congress, Republicans, who have gone along for years, but who don't really believe it. And it's frankly the reality that we've had a cult, and the fear of being excommunicated or shunned or even of physical violence, which has happened to many, including, of course, Brad Raffensperger, the Secretary of State in Georgia, Fred Upton, a friend, a Republican member of Congress from Michigan, who resigned or retired because of the death threats he got having voted for the second impeachment of Trump. A number will feel liberated, I think, if Trump loses. There are many who believe that if he's gone, they can begin to move back to what would be a Lynn Cheney type, very conservative party. But frankly, if Trump disappeared tomorrow, it's not going to happen overnight. It's going to take quite a while. When I look out at the next generation of office holders in the Republican Party coming to Washington, the state legislators, the party officials, God help us, the school board members, they make the Freedom Caucus look moderate by comparison. So it's going to take a generation before that changes. But undoubtedly, if he's gone, more people will speak up. And of course, the fact is 40 of his 44 top officials in the cabinet, his former chief of staff, his former secretary of defense, the chairmen of the Joint Chiefs and other top generals have all said, you can't let this guy back in again. That it is so close is a measure of both a press corps that doesn't take that all that seriously and a group of people who don't believe that it matters very much, that he's not going to be any different than he was in the first term, despite what they say. But clearly, this is a very different phenomenon than we're used to.
Let's go to some of our questions now. Nancy and other people, a question I wanted to put to Lynn. When do you think we'll know the results of the election, both in terms of the popular vote and the Electoral College? And is it because people are being more careful and more rigorous this time, knowing how many people are watching them, how many angry people are watching them?
I think that it is unlikely we will know tomorrow night who has won this election. I suspect it will be a lot like 2020. It will take a couple of days. And no, I don't think that that is because the states are, trying to slow it down and be extra careful. They, like much of the conversation we've had tonight, they all have different processes for how they count ballots. They have different rules about whether they are allowed to start counting those early mail-in ballots when they come in, or some states start counting those. Other states, the rule is they can't start counting them until the polls close in person on that day. So they all have different rules, and that's part of the reason why it takes, even though the polls have closed, all the counties have to send in their counts. But even after that, it sometimes takes time, especially when these elections are turning on so few votes.
And again, Lynn, a question from Barry about the process before the polls close, where we were talking about how states may decide who gets to vote and who doesn't. But Barry's wondering about how voting drop boxes in Black majority voting districts were removed. For example, in Ohio, you get only one in-person voting site per county, whether your county has 500,000 people or 5,000 people. So what impact do you think this is going to have on the outcomes?
Well, I mentioned a little while ago that we see more and more people taking advantage in places where they can request mail-in ballots or where they can go early and vote in person. More and more people are voting early. And I think in places where it has become even more difficult to vote on election day in person, you are likely to see people trying to compensate by voting early. So that would be one thing that you could look at in places like Barry is describing, where the in-person election day polling locations have been minimized to make voting more difficult for people.
But there's still people who will wake up, excuse me 1 second, Norm, there's still people who will wake up and say, oh my God, it's election day, I better go vote.
Yes, yeah.
I think what Barry was referring to is the mail-in votes. And what's happened with Frank LaRose, the Secretary of State in Ohio, what's happened in Texas, Harris County, the biggest county, the most Democratic county, as large as the state of Maryland, those states have limited the number of drop boxes for mail-in votes to one per county. So in Harris County, you got to travel 100 miles.
They're both good answers. Thank you.
Yeah.
Sorry, I misunderstood the question. Okay.
Yeah. And that's they're trying to curtail mail-in voting in those places.
That
is, however, where the turnout apparatus that Democrats have built in, understanding this, is they're trying to find ways to make sure they can expedite having those votes get to the drop boxes or to be mailed. But also keep in mind, we're seeing some sabotage. We've had drop boxes in the states of Washington and Oregon that were set on fire by a vigilante. And they've managed to retrieve many of those votes, but it's become a problem. There are obstacles to voting by mail with people who see votes by mail coming predominantly from minorities and Democrats.
All right, let me go back to Lynn.
Sorry, Pat.
Lynn, go ahead, please.
I just wanted to ask one point of clarification that, if you have a mail-in ballot, you don't have to put it in a drop box. You can put it in the mail, right? So that's the beauty of a mail-in ballot.
You can, but then you're relying on the post office to get it there in a timely fashion. And what we have also seen in many states is they are rejecting ballots that were postmarked before the election but don't arrive until after. So it's a dilemma in two ways.
It's a game either way too, and a lot of, as I say, one state to the other, as Lynn pointed out, varies. So let me get to you, Norm, because we're getting a little close, and a lot of people, including Jerry and Lisa, want to know what you think is going to happen in Congress. There are a lot of congressional seats in California that may contribute to what's going to happen in terms of who runs the House. Of course, we've got a bad-looking map for Democrats in the Senate this time around.
So the House is certainly up for grabs. The Democrats only need to pick up a net of 4 seats. They've got probably a dozen of their own that are at least somewhat in question. They have a lot of opportunities, including several in California. The problem with learning who will have a majority in the House is that, of course, the bizarre way in which California counts ballots, we know those House races we may not know for a month in some cases. And if the majority's hanging in the balance, we might not know that. It becomes particularly important. You might remember that when Donald Trump talked at the Madison Square Garden rally, he said, "We're going to have a big surprise in the House. I can't tell you what it is yet." And it clearly has to do with Mike Johnson, the Speaker, trying to do something to overturn election results if it looks like he's a loser. Not quite January 6th. We've resolved a lot of those issues with the reform of the Electoral Count Act, but something else. So the House majority, especially because the chances of Democrats holding a majority in the Senate are not great, becomes even more important. Many of those key races we are going to know on either election night or the day or two after. There are several in New York. There are some in the Midwest. I would say Democrats probably have a somewhat better than average chance of winning a majority in the House. If it turns out to be a more comfortable victory for Harris, it could be by, 5, 6, 8, or even 10 seats, but it's not at all clear where that will be. And to
Okay,
win a
quickly,
majority in
the
the
Senate.
Senate
Yes.
is so we know that Democrats who basically will need to keep their losses to 1 or 2 have already lost 1 effectively, and that's Joe Manchin's retirement. West Virginia is pretty much gone. There are several seats that Democrats have that are in question in Montana, John Tester, in Ohio, Sherrod Brown, in Nevada, Jackie Rosen, in Wisconsin, where
Tammy
Baldwin is the incumbent, in Michigan, the open seat with Alyssa Slotkin running against former Congressman Mike Rogers. And there are a couple of Republican seats, maybe even 3, that are interesting. One in Nebraska, a very red state,
Real
where
quickly,
independent
yes.
Dan Osborne has a real chance of beating Deb Fischer. And then there's Texas, and where there's a good Democratic candidate and the man very unpopular with everybody, Ted Cruz, and even a stretch, but still there, the unpopular Rick Scott in Florida. But, it's a real stretch to suggest that Democrats could win. And it's possible, at least, that Republicans could have a margin of 3, 4, or even 5.
Oh, my.
That would be hell if Harris won. A Republican Senate would block not only judges, but wreak havoc with executive nominations.
Let's get to Lisa Heck's question that we have for Lynn, which is how you see disinformation affecting the election and how much you think it's happening. We got a warning from the FBI just a few days ago that they had immediately identified a Russian disinformation operation, fake videos of a pair of hands, shredding votes in one state or another. Is this really having an impact, and how deep do you think?
Well, there are 2 ways to think about this. The first is that, remember what we said in the beginning of the hour, persuasion is hard. So if we're worried about misinformation and disinformation coming in to change people's attitudes, that's very hard to do. The candidates have spent $2 billion trying to do that, and they can't do it. So that's one way to think about this. The other way, though, is what you just mentioned, Pat, which is it's not so much that we're trying to change people's minds to get them to vote for one candidate or the other one, but it's that we're trying to get people to take action, to come down to the town square and protest, or to sort of incite people's emotions. And I think that is something to think about, and would be the avenue through which I think this could have more of an impact.
There are a couple of questions here. I'll follow up with one of them here is, and for you, Lynn, what Trump, if he declares victory on election night, what happens? It doesn't make any difference to the vote counting or the outcome, but obviously there's a subtext and a tone he wishes to set, or goodness knows what he still has in mind, although I think we have an idea from January 6th.
I think the smart money is on that happening. And it would not surprise me if very early in the evening, when the polls that close and the states that count early are more likely to be states that lean Republican. And at that moment, it would not surprise me if he comes out and says, people have spoken. This is exactly what we thought was going to happen. I win. And you're right, that is meaningless in terms of who the actual winner is. But it's very complicated in terms of how people understand what is happening in the election. And it's going to require a lot of explaining by whichever news outlet it is that you're watching, that why has he declared victory? Why are these states coming in early? Why do we know the outcomes in these states, but not in the blue states? Why does he think he won? Why do they think he doesn't? Why won't the newscast call it? It is a way to cast doubt on the experts, the people in the states counting the votes, and the people in the news organizations telling Americans how that count is going. And that's a classic Donald Trump move: come in, cast doubt, wreak havoc. And I think this is something that is potentially problematic.
We saw in the year 2000 when we saw the networks call Florida for Al Gore and a staffer at Fox News, who I think was related to the Bush family somehow, called up and said, "Well, wait a minute. You can't call that state for Gore because XYZ," and they pulled back the projection, and we all know what happened thereafter. So, very quick answer, please, from Lynn, and then we'll get to Norman on this about what kind of lawyering you anticipate. EA from Santa Paula, the lawyering up, the intimidation or violence, denialism, and on the other side, you may have just thousands more lawyers as well on the Harris side saying, no, this is not going to happen. You're not going to be able to get away with it just by saying that you won. What kind of a war do you see this going, which is going to run in parallel to the counting of ballots?
Yes, those attorneys are going to be earning their money. That is my short answer.
And Norm, do you have a short answer for us too?
Yeah, well, I want to get back to the Russian stuff as well, and these polls that are showing a Trump landslide, and Trump and Musk and others saying we're going to win handily. This is all a predicate to saying if they lose, it had to have been rigged. And we know that there will be violence that will follow. We've got 500 to 1,000 constitutional sheriffs out there elected in counties who believe that they answer to a higher authority. We know that in many counties that matter, we have election officials who are going to say that they will not countenance or certify the election results in their counties, and that's going to create a complication. We've had hundreds of lawsuits filed that are meritless, but are going to try and tie things up. And what the Russians are doing is to try and bring conflict to America, create even more dissension and tribal conflict. So we have to be prepared for a lot of turmoil in the aftermath of this election. If it is genuinely close, if in fact we're talking about states that, like in 2020, are 0.5%, 1%, 10,000 votes, 12,000 votes, we're going to have a lot to work through before we can come up with a result. Congress, to its great credit, in a bipartisan fashion, tried to take us away from another January 6th. And then we have definite deadlines and the ability to certify these states in December. They have to be met, but brace yourselves. If it's not a convincing victory, we got a lot of turmoil ahead.
All right, so we'll have a wrap up in a moment, but first I want to get Phil in Tucson his question to Lynn, whether you think the institutions are strong enough to withstand what we may see coming tomorrow and in the following days. As I referenced, the most important election in our history. It kind of worked in 2020. And now that we have a Democrat in the White House, maybe it's different this time. Can you give us a quick assessment of how well you think the institutions will hold?
Phil may not be surprised to learn that I'm the optimist on the panel. And I am optimistic about the guardrails and the institutions of democracy. And I don't think that's because there's a Democrat in the White House. I think that there are strong institutions in place. I know it is more complicated this time relative to last time. But I am optimistic that this is not the last election that we will be voting in.
Oh, thank you. All right. Now we'll be able to give just a minute or so to each of you, and we've got to keep an eye on the clock on this because Lynn, you just gave us something optimistic. Let's go to Norm and see if you can give us a minute of optimism on this election eve for everybody to take away with them tonight.
I actually believe that and hope that we are going to have a more convincing victory in the next few days that may make it work a little bit more easily. I do not have confidence if the Republicans hold the House that a speaker who led the way to do election denial in 2020 will operate in a fair fashion. And frankly, I'm very concerned about the courts. The courts stepped up to the plate in 2020, and we had 60 decisions by courts, including by Trump nominated judges, and one by the Supreme Court. It's a different Supreme Court, and we have a lot of judges out there who I'm not sure we can rely on. So we just have to keep our fingers and toes crossed and keep a ready supply of bourbon or whatever else will fill your optimistic heart or make you have a buzz, at least if it turns out to be as rocky as it might.
So Norm, very quickly, you think it really has to be big to make the point home and to kind of nail down the results and keep them more or less safe?
Well, the fact that we do have a Democratic president means that we're not going to have the kind of chicanery involving the National Guard or others that we saw in 2020. We know that we have a lot of people who have learned these lessons. I'm on the task force of Protect Democracy on election crises. We have a lot of efforts out there that are going to try and keep this within bounds. But if it's extremely close, we're going to have a big battle ahead leading up to January and maybe even beyond.
And Lynn, you want to elaborate on the optimism that you answered with that more specific question a bit ago?
I don't have any more optimism than that, Pat. I think so. I will yield my time back to you.
Well, we maybe there's one race or one outcome, Lynn, that you're looking forward to seeing that you think is going to be a hopeful sign.
Well, I don't know. I'm not as big a believer in this latest Iowa poll as I think Norm is, but I think it would be very interesting to see what happens in Iowa, and if Iowa comes out even close to being blue, that is going to make for a very interesting evening.
Will be an interesting evening and many, many long and perhaps interesting evenings yet to come, as there's no way that the results will be known on election night, but we'll all have to hang on for the ride as we have done in years past and who knows, for years yet to come. I want to thank both of you, to Norm Ornstein and to Lynn Vavreck. You can find their works online, their books online as well. We hope you will do so. We also thank you for joining us, and the programs that will be coming up will help you figure out exactly what happened in the election and what it is we've been talking about this evening. I want to thank you for watching and for supporting these programs, which have been so vital throughout this election year and so many other events in the world, trying to make sense and bring your questions to people who are very much in the know. I'm Pat Morrison. Thank you again for watching us.